Hey Village, so this is the weekly installment of our midweek podcast. As you can see, we have a little bit of a unique setting. We're here in the sanctuary just coming after our weekend sermon, and I'm joined by our speaker, Pauline Fong. Pauline, thank you so much for joining me after our preaching. We're so blessed by the message you gave, so thank you for being willing to sit down.
Thanks for having me, Pastor Tony.
Absolutely. And so, Village, as always, we'd love to take this time for our midweek podcast to dive in a little bit deeper into the weekend message. And so there's some poignant points that you made, Pauline, that I'd love for us to unpack even further. I loved how you talked about the dimensions of Jesus, and there's this potential binary that we could box Jesus into. Was Jesus a rule follower? Was he a rule breaker? And if we're not careful, we can really constrain how dynamic Jesus was and how revolutionary in some ways he was, even in his rule following that he was. Could you touch a bit on this dynamic that you proposed to us of loving God and loving neighbors really as a foundation for our understanding our situatedness in culture and society? I know you talked a bit about politics and how yes, Jesus is neither Democrat or Republican. He's especially not a libertarian. And we find ourselves in a fairly contentious season. I mean, it's always been contentious, but right now in our political moment, even though the election is over, we find that even something like the vaccine for COVID-19 is very politicized. Can you speak into that? How does our framework of loving God and loving neighbor give us a navigation for the vaccine?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm just intrigued by Jesus, period.
Yeah.
Because I think it's easy in different streams of Christianity or different practicing forms of Christianity for us to just slot Jesus into a particular, I mentioned dimension, but we could also say like a particular image, right? So, sometimes when I became a believer in high school, the pictures at those times I saw a lot was precious moments. So these, these like dolls that were made of like, it's breakable dolls. They're very fragile. Yeah. And then usually you saw Jesus in some form of like, looking very meek, very mild. Maybe he has a lamb across his shoulder. Yeah. Now that's very biblical. Jesus is that, right? Jesus does go seek out the one, when, out of 100 sheep, when there's one missing, Jesus. So that is who Jesus is, but that's only one picture of who Jesus is. And I think that's why I wanted to talk about the different dimensions of who Jesus is, because different streams or different forms of practicing Christianity may not feel very comfortable with another picture of who Jesus is, right?
Yes.
So, for example, the picture of Jesus holding a whip and actually whipping people out of the temple.
Yes.
That's also in the Bible.
Yes.
But I rarely ever, nobody makes a porcelain doll out of
that. right. It's not on a Hallmark card. Merry Christmas, here's Jesus.
So what happens is then we kind of get conditioned by the precious moments type of picture of who Jesus is. So then when we are trying to figure out what do we do, right? As Christians, we want to do what would Jesus do? And we want to do what Jesus, but unfortunately, if that's our only picture of who Jesus is, then we're not going to be able to actually live out the kind of scripture or the kind of image who Jesus is. Jesus holding a whip and like kicking people out of the temple. And so I think that's why I wanted to talk about different dimensions. And I think that's why it's really relevant to today, because I think it's so difficult right now to figure out, like, how should I think about how should I think about vaccinations?
Absolutely.
How should I think about this or that? And you talked about kind of the extremes. And so I think that's why I wanted to also stay in Mark. So the 2 commandments, that's still in the Gospel of Mark. I intentionally stayed in the entire Gospel of Mark and walked us through, so that I'm not kind of picking different Gospels.
Right.
all of those passages have parallel passages in all the other Gospels as well, so it would be worth looking at that.
Yeah.
But I think it's that kind of walking through, you basically walk through with Jesus, right, in one narrative, essentially. And it's in Mark that Jesus also says these are the two biggest commandments, right? So to me, I think that's what guided Jesus's actions. Now, he had a special connection with God the Father, right? So let's not forget that.
Yes.
But I think those are ways that, he was trying to teach his disciples, right, what to do.
Yes.
And so I think that's why those two commandments are really helpful for us. And I would call them more like, maybe you want to call them like principles or foundations that can guide us, or, it can be our compass, right? In terms of like, we don't know where we're going to go next, right? So if it's vaccinations now, who knows what next year is, right? There's going to be another issue that's going to be like very controversial. We don't know what to do. So I think that's why those are helpful checkpoints.
Yeah.
Those are very helpful checkpoints, but then, we also kind of need to realize that, okay, but that may be interpreted differently.
Absolutely.
So that's why I said, then you got to kind of align that with the rest of Scripture, right? And then also, sometimes we have unintended consequences.
Absolutely.
What we decide we think we should do.
And what I so appreciated about your message was you didn't shy away from politics, but you masterfully address politics without it becoming politicized, without us getting caught up in the vitriol or the talking points. But you so aptly said we need to have our Bible in one hand and the newspaper in another, or our smart device with Scripture in one hand, a smart device with the news in the other, because for all the supposed progressivism of the Pacific Northwest, we have a deep history of racism and just white supremacy. I mean, the Pacific Northwest, as you briefly shared, has a long history with internment camps. Eastern Oregon, Eastern Washington has large populations of Japanese communities because of our history and our involvement in oppressing and interning Japanese Americans. And so when we talk about the need for an awareness of our history, our political moment, and you talk about how Jesus, yes, can't be bought by an ideology, and in some ways Jesus can't be placed on a platform for our political agenda. But what I love about the Gospel of Mark is it's a very political gospel. It's some scholars or theologians will say it's written to the Romans, and that's why there's this quick, fast-paced narrative. There's this theme of Jesus being king in opposition to Caesar, and we see that in the way that the Passion narrative at the end of Mark. Mark is very quick to bring Jesus to his crucifixion in the narrative to show that, if you will, the platform that Jesus has is as king on the cross. And so for you, as you were thinking through our political moment and really trying to preach to our political moment, not to have a politicized message, but a faithful, Christ-centered proclamation, how do you find yourself personally navigating our political moment in the way you situated us with saying, love God and love neighbor?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where sometimes I feel like as I'm trying to make decisions on these social issues of what do I think about a particular issue, I find that I don't fit in any current boxes, right? Yeah. The Democrat box, the Republican box, the Libertarian box, this box, that box. Because on different issues, my pieces feel like if I were trying to be true to following Jesus, I would think this way on this issue, partially. And then I would think this way, partially. So, in some ways it's like, well, Republicans probably think I'm too democratic and too progressive, and then Democrats probably think I'm too conservative, too Republican, because I don't fit in any of those boxes in how I think about things. Yeah. And that's because I'm trying really, really hard in these days, and it's getting harder and harder, right? Because narratives are so extreme. But what I try to do is I actually try really hard to hear the whole spectrum, I try to hear the extremes on both sides. I try to hear stuff in between as a part of my process of discernment and wisdom, right? Because it's not that easy. I wish there was some part in the Bible that just says, think this way on this one. You know, there just isn't. Right. It's more like principles that we have to apply to our current context. And so I don't pretend that I'm like smarter than anybody else. I haven't thought of all the different arguments along the spectrum, but other people have. So I just try really hard to kind of listen to all different sources. So that's why, this is where I would encourage people, don't be stuck in one form of media or news input, because whatever that feed is, it's been packaged, right? It's set
the algorithm,
it's set in a particular narrative. So if that's all you watch, then everything that you watch is going to be bent towards that. So you've got to work really hard to try to get narratives from all along the spectrum, and then really, like I said, check each one, right? Check each one with, does this fit with loving God? Does this fit with loving neighbor as self? You know, and does this fit with the rest of Scripture? And does whatever they're saying have unintended consequences? Because a lot of stuff I'm hearing these days absolutely have unintended consequences, or it just outright doesn't fit. Like it doesn't align with Scripture. Now, if someone's not a Christian, someone's not a follower of Christ, what do you mean? That doesn't fit, right? So that's not their point of view. They're not trying to have a point of view that aligns with Scripture. So that's not their starting point, right? But for me, as a Christ follower, that has to be my starting point. So I have to evaluate all of the different voices, different positions, different solutions along the line.
No, thank you. What I find so difficult is I would be lying if I said I didn't have a particular political bent or a political affiliation. But where I struggle, and I find, especially with how contested and heated our politics are, is how do I guard against allowing a particular narrative to influence the way I read Scripture, rather than allow the narrative of Scripture and what the retelling of what God is doing to influence then therefore how I engage in politics. How do you guard yourself against that when it's so easy to say, well, it's right there in the Scripture, but in reality, upstream, we've consumed all of this algorithm, program, packaged news media that only filters and puts our blinders on when we read the Scriptures. How do you guard against that?
Great question. So there's a couple things that I think I try to put in my life that helps with that. So one is, I think this is where studying the Bible itself, actually with people who are very different from you, different culture, different ethnicity, because a lot of times that comes with a difference in our traditions, in how we view and how we hear, how we receive a certain Scripture. And I've been, in this instance, I've been particularly helped by my African-American Black brothers and sisters. Is like, I'm helped by their perspective in the readings of different Scriptures, because there's just a very different way of reading that. I'm also helped by like international voices, right? People from a different country, right? That actually really reads a particular thing very differently. So that's one thing. The other is, I try really hard to have commentaries from a multiple perspectives, right? So sometimes we don't have access to people from a different culture or a different perspective, but you have access to commentaries, right? From so I've got my African American commentary, I've got my women's commentary, I've got Justo Gonzalez, you know, so I've got commentaries from a multiple variety of whether it's from conservative to liberal to different ethnicities and cultures, different countries. Those we can actually access these days, right? You could Google them and you could actually find them, whereas before you had to actually be in seminary to even know what they are, right? Correct. And then certainly there's pastors here that you can ask, and I've got friends who are very I would say they think very differently than me, and I try to like read their blog posts or talk to them, and there's a lot of people out these days that actually have very different views, have podcasts, blog posts. So if you look for them, or if you ask people who might know, sometimes it's like you got to chase after it a little bit. But I try hard to have those in my I don't want to say tool belt, but my toolbox as I'm trying to read Scripture and trying to understand that, so that I don't fall into that whole trap of like being curated,
Yes,
right? I mean,
yes,
that's actually what happens is
absolutely.
we become curated.
Yes, we think we're manipulating something when in reality we're being manipulated. No,
Yes.
that's such a insightful observation of how we need to read deeply and read widely. And so I know as someone who also is able to share here at Village and preach on our schedule, there are times where there's a final word of encouragement that I would have loved to said to the congregation or those who are watching, but it didn't make it into the sermon. And so if I could just ask, if you had an additional word of encouragement to Village, as an added bonus to those who are watching the podcast and also watch the weekend sermon, what would that be?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I would say if I had more time, I knew it was already going long, so I didn't go there. But, I touched some on social issues. I didn't touch at all on our internal. I mentioned it in terms of there's external social issues, we've got to figure out what we think. But there's also internal Village leadership, how we live as a community type of internal issues, right? How do we work with ourselves? There's a lot of those issues that I think, we need to grapple with as well. And I would say, let's think about those using the same principles.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Instead of like, well, it's always been done this way.
Right.
That's what if I were having a sit down, like heart to heart family talk, that's what I would say. Instead of thinking it's always been done this way, can we actually come back to the very same principles? So that's what I would say.
That's such a good
I
word.
didn't have time to give an example on that, right?
Yeah.
But I would think of different examples of whether it's leadership or how we, I don't know, how we do service, what kind of worship we have, any of those things.
Absolutely.
It's can we talk about those things with those principles in mind rather than we've always done it this way?
No, thank you so much. That is such a good word. Village, if you have questions or comment, please send them in to Tony@villagebeaverton.com. Pauline, thank you so much for the weekend message and sharing your heart. It's so insightful for us as we move towards our fall schedule. Be on the lookout for the happenings here at Village, and absolutely let's move towards one another in loving God and loving our neighbors. So thank you so much for joining us, Pauline.
Thanks, Pastor Tony.
Thank you.